Good morning. It's a delight to be back in Wheaton, at Wheaton College, with lots of friends. I wanted to say just a quick thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to come. It's a real privilege to be with you this morning. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. This familiar passage, as you well know, has generated a tremendous amount of lay and scholarly interest through the ages, and rightly so. It holds pride of place, being part of the opening chapter of God's written self-revelation. It tells us something very profound about ourselves and about our relationship to the God who created us. But what exactly does it tell us? Throughout the history of the interpretation of image and likeness in Genesis 1, the dominant view has been that these terms refer to a spiritual or even mental similarity to God with which humans were endowed at creation. One of the early proponents of this view was the first-century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. And I apologize to those of you who may be in the field of history interpretation for this painfully brief summary. In short, Philo argued that because God is spiritual and non-material, that is, without physical form, to be created in his image and according to his likeness must refer to an immaterial spiritual correspondence. This was the prevailing view in the first 2 centuries AD and continued in popularity with Augustine, who claimed that human likeness to God consists in human memory, in intelligence or understanding, and will, all of which are necessary for knowing, understanding, and loving God. Martin Luther agreed. He claimed, "When Moses says that man was created also in the similitude of God, he indicates that man is not only like God in this respect, that he has the ability to reason or an intellect and a will, but also that he has a likeness of God, that is, a will and intellect by which he understands God and by which he desires what God desires." The non-material interpretation of the Imago Dei was also very popular among German scholars in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Just a couple examples. Dillmann argued that image and likeness could not refer to corporal resemblance because God is spirit. The likeness, therefore, must consist in human's mental capacity or his or her desire for what is true, eternal, and good. Driver agreed, claiming that image and likeness to God was manifest in the human ability to reason and to comprehend moral and religious truth. And although I myself have not conducted yet a scientific study, when I ask Christians, both lay folks, church folks, even seminary students, what they understand image and likeness to mean in Genesis 1, their answers reflect this non-materialistic view almost every time. To be made in God's image and likeness means, they tell me, that we possess qualities such as intelligence and reason, that we have a capacity, although diminished by the fall, for compassion, generosity, creativity, etc. And while I would certainly not deny that humans are endowed with these godly qualities and capacities, and that these qualities and capacities do reflect our Creator, and that the fall diminished these capacities, this non-material interpretation of image and likeness in Genesis 1 has more to do, I suspect, with Philo and Greek philosophy than with Genesis 1 itself, than the biblical and ancient Near Eastern context, which, as it turns out, are crucial for understanding these terms. Despite the popularity of the non-material view of image and likeness in Genesis 1, the idea that God has a form and that the human body resembles it is a prominent idea in rabbinic theology. The premier work on this subject remains Marmerstein's Essays in Anthropomorphism, which was published in 1927. He credits the school of Rabbi Akiva and their literal reading of the biblical text with the development of an anthropomorphic understanding of God. In short, God has a body because the Bible says so. At many points in the Old Testament, of course, God is described in anthropomorphic terms. He redeems Israel with an outstretched arm. He smells the pleasing aroma of sacrifice. His eyes run to and fro throughout the earth, and the cry of the afflicted reaches his ears. And he even appears in human form. Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel's vision of God, he is described as has a likeness of a human appearance. And of course, Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days, is described as seated. He's got white clothing, white hair. And he's described as one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. Building on this idea that image and likeness refers to a corporal resemblance, a German scholar by the name of Noldecki related the term image to its cognate in Arabic, which means to cut or to cut off, in reference to sculpture. And he concluded that image in Genesis 1 refers to physical representation based on this Arabic cognate. And the idea may even be supported by Genesis 5:3, which is the genealogy of Adam, the only other place in the Old Testament where these two terms appear together, by the way, where Adam's fathering of Seth in his own image and likeness is analogous to God's creation of humanity in God's likeness. The famous form critic Hermann Gunkel also based his understanding of image and likeness in Genesis 1 on the parallel in Genesis 5. He comments, God created Adam in his image. Adam begot Seth in his image. The second statement is very clear, right? Just like a German. The son looks like the father. He resembles him in form and appearance. The first statement is to be interpreted accordingly. The first human resembles God in form and appearance. This material interpretation of image and likeness in Genesis 1 may seem far-fetched to some of us, to those of us accustomed to thinking of God only in spiritual terms. Its proponents are right, however, to insist that we interpret these terms in Genesis 1 in light of these two terms in Genesis 5, where its meaning seems less obscure. Whatever we make of the terms in Genesis 1, they must have something to do with the way they are used in Genesis 5. I think the primary weakness, however, of this view is that it interprets the terms too narrowly. Indeed, image and likeness can refer to physical similarity, but they are not limited to it. We need to keep looking. A third view, which interprets image and likeness in terms of relationship, is perhaps best represented by the Swiss theologian Karl Barth. In sum, when contrasted with the animals, humans are unique in their capacity to relate to God. Humans can act and respond to God. Unlike the animals, humans can enter into a covenant relationship with God. This relationship is defined by two features of the creation account in Genesis 1. The plural in verse 26, let us make, which Barth interpreted as a reference to the plurality within the one God, the Trinity, and the creation of humanity in two distinct genders. By being created male and female, humanity is both plural and differentiated, and thus it reflects the nature and relationship within the Godhead. In short, according to Barth, image in Genesis 1 does not refer to qualities nor characteristics, nor does it define physical form. Rather, it consists in the analogy of relation. That is, the relationship between male and female is in some way analogous to or a reflection of the relationship among the members of the Trinity. One of the strengths of this view is that it recognizes the relational component that the terms image and likeness in Genesis 1 imply. However, where I think it falls short is that it fails to ground its case in the text, within its biblical and ancient Near Eastern context. And therefore, I think the mistake it makes is to mistake aspect, meaning an aspect or feature of what it means to be made in God's image, for meaning, what the terms actually mean in their context. The fourth and final view I will mention in this very brief and selective overview is what I will call the royal representative view. And it was in 1915, another German, Johann Hein, explained image and likeness in Genesis 1 in light of Egyptian and Babylonian parallels. These parallels refer to the king as the image of the god. Hein concluded that image and likeness functioned similarly in Genesis 1, and hence are royal designations for humanity. To be created in God's image, thus, is interpreted in this view in terms of function. to rule over, subdue, and care for the earth and its inhabitants. Haynes' work, and there are many others who have built upon it, has had a powerful influence in Imago Dei studies. Among scholars, I think it's safe to say this is probably the prevailing view, although it doesn't seem to have made its way into the church in any significant measure. The obvious strength of the royal representative view is that it reads Genesis 1 in its ancient Near Eastern context and is able, therefore, to identify a critical piece of the interpretive puzzle. I suggest, however, that humanity's royal status is derived from its identity as defined by image and likeness. That is, humans are endowed with the royal status because they are made in the image and likeness of God. So thus, while understanding these terms within their ancient Near Eastern context was an interpretive breakthrough in Imago Dei studies, the royal status and representative function, I am trying to make the case at least, are derived from identity, the identity which is defined as being created in the image of God. I don't think it's purely functional. Our primary question then has still not been answered. What does it mean that humanity is created in God's image? How is it that Genesis 1, 26 and 27 frame the divine-human relationship? Where do we turn? Well, I suggest we turn backwards to the Old Testament itself and to the wider context for the Old Testament, the ancient Near Eastern world. I mentioned Genesis 5, the genealogy of Adam, the only other place where image and likeness appear together. And I'll read just the relevant verse. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. Here, image and likeness express correspondence. Seth is in some way similar to his father, yet he is not Adam, just as Adam and Eve are like God in some way, yet they are not God. The author gives no explanation what constitutes the likeness, but the plain reading of the text suggests that Seth resembles his father simply because he was begotten by him. And by analogy, humans correspond to God because they're created by him. Thus, this correspondence is intrinsic to being human or having been created. When read in light of Genesis 1, which Genesis 5 clearly is referring back to Genesis 1, the specific type of correspondence the author may have in mind seems to be that of class, type, genus, species. Seth is a human being, not a fish, not a bird, nor a sheep, because his father is a human being. In short, to be created in Adam's likeness and according to his image means that Seth was created according to Adam's kind. The term for image also appears in Genesis 9, verses 5 and 6. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from humanity. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of its man or a human, by a human shall his blood be shed. Why? Because in the image of God he made man. So why does God require the death of the one who sheds blood? The reason given here in verse 6 is because we are made in God's image. And in the image of God, that phrase is even fronted for emphasis in verse 6. It's important. So what is it about the nature of humanity as created in God's image that requires the death of the murderer? As stated in Genesis 9:6, one who pours out the blood, spills the blood, sheds the blood of another, the Lord requires that he pays with his own lifeblood. 2 Chronicles 24 records one such case. As Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, dies, he cries out for the Lord to avenge his unjust death at the hand of the evil king Joash. God sends the Syrian army and even Joash's own servants to execute his divine vengeance. Joash is killed, according to 2 Chronicles 24:25, because of the shed blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest. Although the Lord in this case used human agents, Zechariah understands that it is God himself who is the divine avenger of his spilt blood, as revealed in his dying words, "May the Lord see and avenge." The psalmist ascribes the same role to the Lord when he proclaims, "Sing praises to the Lord who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the people his deeds. For he who avenges shed blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted." You may be familiar with the term Goel, often translated as kinsman redeemer from the book of Ruth. This, of course, is the role that Boaz fulfills by marrying Ruth, reclaiming the family property, and fathering a son to carry on the family line of her former husband. The term is probably best rendered simply to act as a kinsman, because the duties included not only defending and maintaining the welfare and rights of one's relatives, but avenging the blood of murdered family members. The specific title given to the avenger was the Goel of blood, or the kinsman of blood. Nowhere in the Old Testament is God referred to explicitly with this title, but Zechariah's cry for the Lord to see and avenge in 2 Chronicles 24, and the psalmist's identification of the Lord as the avenger of shed blood indicates that God was understood to fulfill this role. What does this reveal about the Lord's relationship to humanity as a whole? If he is indeed the divine blood avenger, then he is, following the metaphor, humanity's nearest kin. Human beings are members of his clan and are therefore kin to one another. For this reason, shedding blood of your fellow man is fratricide. Furthermore, to murder one's kinsman is to slay a member of God's family. The one who strikes you, Zechariah 2, strikes the pupil of the Lord's eye. As the divine blood avenger, the Lord may rightly take the life of the offender, whether he does so himself, directly through divine judgment, or through an appointed human agent. Where are we? All right, so far we have seen that in Genesis 5, image and likeness are terms that classify. For Seth to be created in Adam's image and likeness identifies him as a human being. He is Adam's kind. He is kin, and specifically son. And in Genesis 9, kind is also further specified as kin. The Lord demands the life of the murderer because that murderer has killed a member of God's family. It's a metaphor. So how does this inform our understanding of image and likeness in Genesis 1? Is there any indication in Genesis 1 that humanity is described as God's kin, kind, or son even? In chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, God creates vegetation, plants, and fruit trees, all of which reproduce, each according to its own kind. 3 times in these 2 verses alone, the phrase according to its kind or according to their kind are used to describe the correspondence between the plants and the fruit trees that God created, and then the next generation of plants and fruit trees produced by the vegetation and the trees themselves. God also creates the sea creatures and the birds according to their kind. He saw that it was good. He commanded them to reproduce according to their kind. Then he makes the living creatures that inhabit the earth, each according to their kind. And he sees that this is good. In total, the phrase according to its kind or their kind is repeated in 10 times in 7 verses. Clearly, Genesis 1 emphasizes the creation and reproduction of each species according to its own type or class. However, in the next 2 verses, the creation of the first human pair is not described with these words, according to its kind or his kind, as might have been expected, but instead, in the image of God. The juxtaposition of the repeated, according to its kind or their kind, with in the image of God suggests at least 2 things. Genesis 1 draws a sharp distinction between humanity, male and female, on one hand, and the other created beings. And 2, just as the plants and animals were created according to their own type, humanity, male and female, was made, metaphorically speaking, according to God's kind. The author could have employed the same words and constructions that he used with the plants and animals, but he didn't. Rather, he expressed the relationship between the Father or between God and human beings with image and likeness, terms that we know from Genesis 5 and 9 are kinship terms. To be created in the image of God seems to be created according to God's kind, to be his kin, to be like his son. It is appropriate to ask at this point whether or not there are any Old Testament texts that identify God as humanity's divine father. The notion of God as Father is well attested elsewhere in the Old Testament, where it denotes the Lord's relationship to corporate Israel. He was referred to explicitly as God's child. Deuteronomy 32:6, and I'm just going to give you a few examples. The Lord is named as Israel's father, who created, made, and established them. Twice in Jeremiah, the Lord is identified as Israel's father, and elsewhere, of course, Israel is described not only as God's son, but as his firstborn son in Exodus 4, whom he will carry, nurture, and comfort. Israel refers to the Lord as their father in Isaiah 63, 64, and some other places as well. The point being, there are many examples, of course, where where that metaphor of father is applied to the relationship between God and Israel, as well as the Israelite king, right? 2 Samuel 7, the Lord says in reference to Solomon, I will be his father and he will be my son. And then, of course, the parade example being Psalm 2:7. The Lord says to the king, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. We must keep in mind, however, that nowhere in the Old Testament is humanity described explicitly as God's son or even like God's son. However, the use of image and likeness to define God, Father, mankind, Son relationship in Genesis 5, this contrast that I pointed out in Genesis 1 between plants, animals, and the way that they're described as reproducing according to their kinds, and humans being image and likeness of God, and the connection between the Israelite king as the son and humanity as the Lord's appointed king over creation in Genesis 1, suggests that Genesis 1 may indeed frame the divine-human relationship in terms of kinship, and specifically in terms of sonship. Not only do we see evidence for this within the Old Testament, but I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from the wider biblical world, the ancient Near Eastern world, that suggest that this is the case. Divine sonship, of course, in the ancient Near East is an enormous topic, so we're going to look at just a couple examples. The first one, beginning with the Assyrian king by the name of Tukulti-Ninurta I. He ruled in the mid to late 13th century BC. The divine royal relationship was expressed anew in some very interesting terms, in terms of statue manufacture and in terms of divine birth. In this very famous hymn, the king's body is likened to the flesh of the gods, a phrase that is known elsewhere in Assyrian mythology, where it describes the wood from which statues were actually made. Statues, what we would call idols, were made. The hymn goes on about this king. He was successfully engendered through or cast into the channel of the womb of the gods, and as a result, he alone is the eternal image, it's the same word that we have in Genesis 1, of Enlil, Enlil being his patron deity. Enlil raised him like a natural father after his firstborn son. The combination of birthing and manufacturing imagery is striking. Not only is the Assyrian king's body likened to a divine statue, but the process of his creation is described both in terms of manufacture and procreation. Harvard professor Peter Machinist rightly concludes that here, image identifies the physical body of the king with a divine statue. However, I would add that in this context, image may have been intended as a double entendre, referring not only to the king as a living statue, a representative of his God, but also as his royal son. Although the hymn avoids deifying this Assyrian king, it certainly leaves the reader with the impression that Tukulti-Ninurta, unlike any other human being, has a unique and special relationship with his God, which finds its closest analogy in sonship. The opening lines of the Babylonian creation story, Enuma Elish, reinforces the idea that image and likeness terminology could be used to designate sonship. The account begins with the creation of the primordial gods. Apsu and Tiamat beget Lachmu, Lahamu, Anshar, and Kishar. Anshar and Kishar then beget their firstborn son by the name of Anu, and guess how Anu is described? As the image of his father. The following line reads, and Anu begot Nudimud, another son, his image. Both examples define the father-son relationship in terms of image and likeness. Anu is the image of his father Anshar, Ea is the likeness of his father Anu. There are many other texts to which we could appeal, but I think these examples make the point. There is one other text from the 10th dynasty, a wisdom text from Egypt, where we do have humanity being defined as image and offspring of a god, or of the creator god. And this is from a text known as the Instructions for Merikare, and I'm just going to read you a couple lines. Well provided is humanity, the cattle of the God. It was for their sake that he made heaven and earth and repelled the greed of the waters. And it was so that their nostrils might live or breathe, that he made the winds. They are his images which have come forth from his body, and he shines in heaven for their sake. It is for them that he made the plants, cattle, birds, and fish to nourish them. So while the term here translated images actually can refer to a statue in the context, it clearly indicates offspring. Images are offspring. The cumulative evidence from Genesis, from the various texts that identify the Lord as the Father of Israel and the Israelite king, and from these few extra-biblical examples, demonstrate that image and likeness terminology was indeed used in the ancient Near East to denote the relationship between father and son, or parent and child. Further, the hymn of the Assyrian king that I read, a few lines there, showed that these terms can be used as a double entendre in which the relationship of the God and the king is described in more than one way with one term, both as royal image or statue and son or child. And it is my contention that this, and others have argued this, I'm just throwing in a few more examples, this is how image and likeness are used in Genesis 1. Humanity is defined both as God's royal son/child, but also as living statuettes who represent God and his rule in his macro temple, that is the world. I focus more on the former because the connection between image and sonship has received far less attention in the Genesis commentaries, at least, and the secondary sources, despite the fact that it is equally significant in defining the divine-human relationship. We've at least tentatively established that image and likeness in Genesis 1 refers not only to representation, but also sonship. So now we ask the so what question. What does it look like to be God's royal representative and son or child? How could this identity, as created in God's image, as representative and metaphorical son, work itself out in the day-to-day? One of the questions that the conference organizers gave us was this, although I modified it slightly. How can our understanding of the Imago Dei inform and strengthen our witness in this image-driven age? This indeed is where the rubber hits the road. Israel's missionary calling was to live their life as a firstborn son before the watching eyes of the nations in order to show them what it meant to know their heavenly Father. They were to be a showcase people, as Michael Goheen puts it, a display people whose very lives embodied their identity as images of God, whose day-to-day in every area, social, economic, political, the arts, was a living gospel testimony of what it looked like for the redeemed Son to live in right relationship with the Father. I want to read you this quote. This is from A Light to the Nations, the Missional Church and the Biblical Story by Michael Goheen. God's mission involves God's people living in God's way in the sight of the nations. Israel was to be a display people, embodying in its communal life God's original creational intention and eschatological goal for humanity. He would come and dwell among them and give them his Torah to direct their corporate life in his way. God's people were to be an attractive sign before all nations of what God had intended in the beginning and of the goal toward which he was moving, the restoration of all creation and human life from the corruption of sin. Israel would assume its place in God's mission primarily by being what he called it to be, since mission is not primarily about going, nor is mission primarily about doing anything. Mission is about being. It is about being a distinctive kind of people, a countercultural community among the nations. I want to look at one quick example of that, and it's going to seem strange at first, so just stay with me. But it actually comes out of Leviticus 19. Okay? In many study Bibles, the chapter heading you'll find with Leviticus 19 is miscellaneous laws. Okay? As if you didn't have a hard enough time reading Leviticus. And I admit at first glance, if you run through the list, it does seem to be a somewhat random collection. However, the opening two verses And the repetition of I am the Lord your God, 15 times in 37 verses, makes it clear what holds these laws together. Each of the following commandments in chapter 19 highlights a particular manifestation of God's holiness that Israel was to imitate, and by so doing, to be a living manifestation before the watching eyes of the nations of what it meant to live out God's original intention for humanity as his royal children and representatives, so that the nations would find a relationship with God irresistible. God's people were to live out their identity as image, son, daughter, representative, and Israel specifically firstborn son, by the way, which of course is granted to New Testament believers, male and female, or firstborn sons. Not only through what we might consider the more obvious means, proper observance of religious ritual, sacrifice, prayer, studying the Torah, abstaining from making and worshiping idols, participation and observance of religious holidays, but by the way they lived their lives, including how they dealt with money, how they treated their employees, how they conducted business, and how they used their wealth to care for the poor. No aspect of Israel's life was to be untouched. Consider these laws from Leviticus 19. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not use dishonest scales when measuring length, weight, or quantity. Use honest scales and honest weights, an honest ephah and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap right up to the edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord. These laws were grounded in Israel's redemption, in God's redemption of Israel as his firstborn son. The gleaning laws were designed to do many things: provide sustenance for the poor and the foreigner through their own labor without having to beg, to allow the landless to nevertheless benefit from the land which was given by and belonged to God, to allow the poor to participate in worship, for from their gleanings they had something to tithe, and to keep landowners from becoming greedy, self-sufficient, prideful, and hard-hearted. Leaving some of the produce behind was both a reminder of God's mercy and an expression of gratitude to God, the landowner divine, who had redeemed his firstborn son from slavery in Egypt, given them land, and provided for them. As you well know, Israel failed miserably in distinguishing herself from the nations. God's people spurned and rejected their sonship, not only through the worship of foreign gods like Baal and Asherah, but by their idolatry of self, manifest in, among other things, their oppression of the poor and through their self-centered business practices. I won't take the time to read them, but Amos 2, Amos 4 highlight some of these. Amos, most of Amos is one of the things he's dealing with the northern kingdom. However, in the days when the judges ruled, long before Amos lived and prophesied, there was a man from the clan of Elimelech, a human kinsman redeemer by the name of Boaz, a story with which I'm sure you are familiar. Boaz is introduced in the beginning of the book as a worthy man or a man of standing, as it's translated in the ESV or the NIV, and the story proves this to be true, but I think here the King James gets it right. Boaz was rich. And although I want to avoid turning Boaz into a Bible hero, that's not what the story's about, but here we have an example of a wealthy businessman who adhered to the covenant prescriptions, and in the case of Ruth, went far beyond them. His compliance resulted not only in much-needed provision for those who gleaned in his fields, but I imagine that his obedience during the days when there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes surely would have been a gospel testimony, a living witness of how one's status as image and son was to be manifest in life, in business, and in his particular context. Remember those miscellaneous laws in Leviticus 19? Specifically the ones about the gleanings in the field after the harvest, or paying a worker when his or her work is done. These reflect God's holiness, but they also are manifestations of what it means to be made and live as an image of God. Concrete examples of our firstborn status. What would it look like for a business to operate by this principle of love, where people were more important than profit? Like Boaz, we live in a time when everyone does what is right in his or her own eyes. But companies, art studios, public schools, law firms, hospitals, classrooms inhabited by God's people who are living out a right understanding of their identity as image, as son, as royal representative, which, by the way, includes challenging head-on the false images and idolatries of our own day, can demonstrate to a watching world what it is to live as one who understands his or her true identity. It was Israel's mission, and it is ours for the sake of the world.